Hello, and welcome to episode 9 of the dystopian novel They Said There Was. And today we're starting chapter 30. When she contacted him again, he was eager to talk to her. It had been dull without her, and doing the chores wasn't what he considered something to pass the time in an enjoyable way with. He discovered the secrets of the washing machine, but not how to do a wash that got any of the sweat stains out of his shirts. The water seemed very cold. He hoped the shirts would not need to be ironed, and hung them up on hangers he found in the wardrobe on the clothes horse in his wife's laundry room. More of this kind of thing, and he'd be wearing an apron. He couldn't wait to talk to Bruna, because they could discuss meeting soon. He was sure he'd like her as much in person as he did in the metaversal app. Maybe she could get a nurse's job that was nearer to home when the pandemic death count came down and all this disruption to normal life was over. That would solve a lot of problems. And he could be her cowboy Bill. He chuckled. That would be their secret name for him. When he got back to work, he'd have photos of himself and Bruna to show off from the holiday destinations they'd been to, and he felt sure the other men at work would be jealous of him having such a beautiful woman on his arm, as they say. After abandoning the frying pan immersed in water, since the burns seemed to be dried into it somehow, and the pan needed washing properly after it had smoked up the kitchen on its last juice, he went back to the office to lie down and check his phone for messages. He fell asleep, dreamed of Bruna running her nurse's hands over him, and he woke up feeling sticky and warm. At least he would have clean underpants later. They were drying on a radiator in the living room. Bruna needed more money, as there had been an outbreak of the illness on the flight she'd booked, and she would have to stay in a hotel for a few nights until they organised another flight for the passengers not infected. She had to take a test with the other passengers to see if she'd caught the disease. If she had, she'd have to stay in the room for weeks until she got a test to say she was clear of the virus. She was hopeful she'd be okay, though. They talked back and forth a while about it, and how she still had a slight chance of catching it, even with the jab, although she hadn't yet, in her work with patients. So she was confident she would be let travel onwards. She had enough money for the room tonight, but not for the next night, and she would need food money too. She was very grateful to him. They talked in the metaversal environment for ages that evening, and she took her bikini top off. Her breasts were magnificent, really tanned with dark nipples that stood up. He lay with one hand down his pants, having opened the belt, and read off the things she was saying about her cowboy Bill, and how sexy he looked in his hat, while she shimmied and asked if it would be too naughty if she told him she had fantasies about making love to him on the ground beside the waterfall. She was leaning over now and asking him to lie on the ground with her beside the stream, still talking, because he'd told her, yes, he'd like that. She said she wanted to make him the happiest cowboy in the world. She promised to email him some more pictures soon to say thank you for being a wonderful cowboy, riding to her rescue. She posted a new address to wire the money to, the same way. She got the money and was still at the hotel. She said she'd like to talk to him in person. She told him to go to her personal website in the evening and log in for a private chat. They could talk about meeting up soon if he liked. He could hardly wait for 10 p.m. when he was to chat to her. Would her voice be as nice as she was? He thought she would probably have a soothing voice, as nurses probably did, from talking at bedsides. And he wondered where they would arrange to meet. His house, he guessed. Best to try to persuade her to get a hotel near him, then clean the house up so she'd be impressed when she visited, as she was bound to, after the initial meeting. He'd have to get flowers and chocolates for her because women want those kinds of things, and she'd be happy with those. He might get a new suit too, now that the shops were open again. He couldn't exactly turn up as a cowboy, as he was determined to look smart to impress her. She was worth the effort. She was very glamorous, judging from the outfits she was always trying on in the metaversal environment, showing off her long legs and big breasts to make him happy. She would expect an expensive bouquet. Probably best to let a florist pick something out and pick it up on the way to the hotel to meet her, so the neighbours wouldn't wonder what was going on if they were looking out the window and saw him. When he logged into her website at 10 p.m., he noticed that he had to pay to go into the webcam area of the site. But it wasn't surprising since she wanted privacy for them, so it probably discouraged others from joining and made it easy for her to see it was him coming in, to keep the conversation away from others snooping. They hadn't had that luxury in the Metaversal app, as sometimes other people wandered by nearby, or bits of their conversation appeared on the screen if they were near them, in the jungle or at the waterfall, which seemed to be a popular spot. He'd seen a couple there lying down, and from their movements he gathered they were pretending to have sex. He and Bruna had gone further away onto the beach to talk then. There were options buttons in the video area that took a few moments to figure out after he got through the payments process. He'd had to sign up for 6 months' payments because he couldn't find anything that let you do a single video chat. But it said you could cancel anytime, so it probably would refund you the rest when you found that option. Getting used to new websites with all their different options wasn't easy. He thought he was getting better at it though, maybe from using the Metaversal app to meet Bruna so often. As he sat, wondering how to make the screen that said live video cam start, it sprang to life. There was Bruna, or part of her, her breasts, leaning over the camera as she turned it on. "Oops, you've just caught me getting dressed, Cowboy Bill. Can you wait a minute, honey?" He loved the way she called him honey. "Yes, of course," he said, and sat watching his phone screen as she wandered around the hotel room, looking for her clothing. She was in a pink lacy bra and pants thing, and there was a lot of her body showing. It was nearly as beautiful as the avatar in the metaversal environment that she used, except she didn't have the tan as much. She was paler skinned and her waist not as tiny. When she turned around and leaned over the bed to pick up another lace something to put on, he could see almost her entire rump, which was raised as she bent down, with a tiny strap of lace running up the back, hiding very little. She took a long time retrieving the clothing from the bed and returned eventually to the screen, saying how lovely it was to see him in private like this, where they could really talk. She was standing, fiddling with something else, pink, around her waist, readjusting it before lifting a leg onto the chair in front of the screen to attach it to a stocking by a snap button. He could hardly hear what she was saying, as he could see things he wasn't sure she knew she was showing him. She didn't appear to have any hair down there, like Deirdre, who had blonde fuzz. They talked for an hour that night after she had put on the lacy bathrobe and repositioned the camera to angle it up to her face. She was so beautiful, and she said she was wanting badly to meet him. She could hardly wait until her trip was over so that they could meet up and really get to know one another. Just as they were starting to talk about where and when, the camera went black. He thought his phone's battery might be dead, but it wasn't, because he got a message from her straight afterwards saying she had loved every second of meeting him, thought he was a very sexy and interesting man, and couldn't wait to talk to him again. She didn't say when, but he knew it would be soon. It was exciting having a new woman in his life. He almost enjoyed housework for a few days, thinking of how Bruna would see the rooms. He made sure to put Deirdre's craft things out of sight and her paintings, and decided hoovering the floors would have to be left until after he had the clothes dry and put away, and all the dishes and cutlery completed. 2 shirts were only fit for the bin, since they had dried with strange new stains on them, as well as the sweat stains not coming out. And when he took them off the hangers, he saw that they had rust from the hangers dried into them, which didn't seem to come out, even after scrubbing vigorously at the bathroom sink with a nail brush. As he dried his hands, enjoying the fact he had a clean towel at his disposal now, he decided he'd have to make a trip to buy new clothing. Usually Deirdre bought clothes, but he'd looked at the labels on a few things and saw that she bought a lot from the same place. He headed off, confident he'd be able to find it, as the name sounded slightly familiar. After a bit of driving around slowly in town in traffic and a few circular trips around the streets with the most shops, he saw it and parked up in the big car park, which conveniently you could pay for using your phone as well. How did we manage before phones, he wondered. They were so convenient, and you could do nearly everything on them, including meeting the perfect woman for you. He laughed to himself as he entered the sliding doors that led into the inside of the store. It had a lot of things that had nothing to do with clothing, all sorts of furniture and lamps and toys for children. Then there were whole aisles of women's clothes. There were even mirrors and seats near displays that formed islands around which people circulated. It was a huge shop and slightly confusing, despite having the lines and arrows to show you where to walk when you got past the door, where a security guard checked your vaccine status on your phone. And despite everyone sticking to the rules about wearing masks and standing in your circled zone at the checkouts as per the instructions that were played on a looped recording over music, which got louder in between the messages. He'd walked around nearly all the sections before he found the clothes for men. He had to stand for a while to remember what he came in for, trying to tune out the music that was playing, and which he found distracted his focus from the task at hand. Yes, suits, 2 at least, and shirts. He might need 7 of those because he didn't want to have to do washing more than once the following week or any week, and his shirts hadn't come out of the wash looking very clean. His shoes were very scuffed as well. The soles had worn thin, and Deirdre had said last time he'd asked her to get them fixed that they didn't fix shoe soles anymore. You just bought new ones. Seemed a bit foolish an expense when the tops of them looked fine, but he'd had to tell her to get new ones that time. He hoped they had shoes in this shop, as well as clothes, because he didn't think he'd have the energy to look for other places to buy those after finding all the other things he needed in this shop. He had been several hours just getting this far already. He found 2 suits in the same size that the labels on his old suits that hadn't survived washing very well had been marked with. One was in brown and the other grey. He paused at a rack labelled formal suits and considered. Would he be pushing the boat out a bit, as they say, on dates with Bruna in fancy restaurants? You were probably expected to. And he remembered all the films he'd ever sat through that Deirdre liked, with couples in restaurants which expected you to dress up if it was night time and pay for the woman's meal to impress her. Luckily, he usually avoided those situations in the early days with Deirdre, and even on holidays, the bistros Deirdre picked out weren't exactly fine dining, top-notch places, and he usually split the bill as you did with your wife. Bruna might expect something splashy, though, at least once, and would want him to impress her. It was his chance to show her how good a choice he was, financially, as a prospective husband. She might notice his clothing and want something fancy as well as a fancy date. He picked up a dark blue suit that had a bit of shininess in it. She'd probably like that. There were hankies and ties in sets above the suits, and he picked up one set he'd noticed on a mannequin display standing beside the suit. He'd probably look every bit as good as the mannequin in the blue suit. He wished he had a big square jaw like the mannequin. Bruna would have liked that. He needed a haircut too, he realised. Better find a barber's after this. He examined the shoes on the display models, then set out to discover where the shoes were. There were all sorts of pointy and shiny ones in different colours, but he chose a pair he'd seen on the display, since that must be the most popular pair, and the pair that looked most like the ones he already had, that had worn down in the back and gotten scuffed up. The shoes could be tried on, sitting on a round couch beside the racks of them, if you waited for the previous customer to finish trying theirs on, as the instructions on the floor told you had to wait to be safe, and had a comic-style picture of a face with a mask on to remind you why that was important. Although, if you had the right size, he wondered, why were you supposed to try them on? Still, others were waiting, so he joined the queue for that, keeping his distance, as clearly you were expected to try them on. They fit him, and after he'd put his old shoes back on, tying up the laces tidily, he walked around with the suits and shirts over his arms, and the tie sets and hankies that were threatening to fall in a basket that he found in a stack beside a display to put his items in while he shopped. He thought they only did that for food, but you did it with clothes as well, it seemed. He could see as he walked through the shop, there was also a big supermarket as well for buying food in. It was a huge store, and he never found the place where you could try on the clothes. He only found the female one. You must be able to buy them without having to put them on, though. He was very hot and the music playing wasn't helping. His feet, although in the old comfortable shoes, were starting to hurt, and he was hungry too now. A look at his phone showed it had been 5.5 hours since he set out on his mission, and he still would have to get a haircut. Cowboy Bill, he had to admit, was wilting a little and wanted to head off into the sunset back to the house. Chapter 31. He'd spent a huge amount of money, he realised, on looking at the receipt when he got home and finally got time to sit down. He ran his hand through his freshly cut hair, trying to take in the reality of how much a suit cost. He'd never noticed before, but when you saw the prices of everything on the list and the total with the receipts added up, wow! It was as expensive as the tickets for the last 2 holidays he and Deirdre had paid for last time, and he'd paid this just for a few suits and ties and some shoes. Then there was all the money he'd given to Bruna. She'd promised to pay it back, mind you. She was very insistent about that, saying it was just a cash flow problem, so that was all right. It might just make his budget totting up a bit more difficult at the end of the month, since he'd have to work out how much of his savings were gone and get the money back in as soon as it was repaid. He was also a bit nervous about when exactly he'd be called back to work. He wasn't a millionaire after all and couldn't afford to keep dipping into his savings forever. Bruna, though, was worth splashing out on, as she was an investment of sorts. He couldn't keep paying bills on his own either, and the monthly accounts would be a nightmare that he would have to brace himself for this month. Luckily, Bruna was a chief nurse, whatever that was, and her cash flow problems were temporary, like his, she'd pointed out, so things would be looking up soon. He wondered what kind of wages chief nurses got. He'd had to part with more money as the next month came because Bruna had caught the virus. She wasn't feeling sick, she said, but had to cancel her flight and stay at the hotel until she got 3 clear tests in a row, to be taken a few days apart to say the virus had left her system. He'd paid for her hotel stay, and it had been a pleasant time for both of them because they got to talk a lot in Metaversal and on her webcam, as apparently it was called, on her site, about her plans to see him as soon as the next job was over. Those poor Africans, she said, would still need their injections, and there were too few nurses to get through all the villagers. So they were desperately in need of her to oversee the other nurses and get it done, to save lives or whatever. At home, the passport system seemed to be a great success so far. News programs showed all the technologies they were introducing, which would help identify people trying to scam the system. Scamming was when you said you were vaccinated, but weren't. And it was shocking to hear that some people had created fake documents, which they were showing on their phones when asked at shops and restaurants to prove they were vaccinated. The new machines that you swiped your phone through could pick up the fake documents, and the police could then identify whose phone it came from and arrest the person. Others who had got away with not wearing masks somehow in the past could be given huge fines every time they were caught, or face long prison sentences for putting everyone else in danger. Hehe. The woman next door wouldn't last long with some of the new rules and the technology they'd invented. They had cameras now that shops could use inside that zoomed right in on people's faces and found out who they were by referring to other collected images of them online from other forms of ID you'd used that they'd saved in their files. They might catch Deirdre going out somewhere with their friends, or even her parents too. It would be well deserved if people like that went to jail for trying to kill people with their germs. He didn't understand how that system worked totally, but apparently they had a lot of files on people online that the police had access to, which matched their faces with other things they'd signed up for, like driving licenses, and they could even follow you about if you were a repeat lawbreaker to see if you kept it up, the reckless rule breaking. Then they could swoop in and arrest you, and you'd no chance of escape because they had the proof on camera that it was you swanning about without a mask or putting others in danger, standing too close, or something else dangerous, like meeting up with people for parties. Because the vaccines hadn't worked quite as well as they'd hoped in fully protecting people from getting sick, they'd had to introduce these new measures. And things would, unfortunately, they said, be getting a bit stricter for a while to get control of the situation before it got super critical again. Even being called to task by other members of the public, reminding them that they were putting lives in danger, had no effects on these kinds of people. Yes, he thought, they're monsters who don't care about society, just themselves. Robert considered this illness concern in the light of meeting Bruna. They had talked about it for quite a while now, but these new measures and tightened restrictions, reintroduced after being relaxed for a short time, could wreck his chances of meeting with her soon and potentially persuading her to stay, at least in the area, if she was opposed to moving in with them before they were married. They hadn't discussed marriage yet, but it seemed likely, since women want the engagement ring to seal the deal and get married before moving in, and he wanted this too, because neighbours might think she's a loose woman if they weren't married. They might have to wait weeks, maybe months more, to resolve this issue. She definitely loved him and wanted him. She'd told him so. There was also the related issue of work. If travel restrictions came in again, they might not want him back at work, but instead continue with their skeleton staff arrangement, since the great unwashed wouldn't be back queuing up to sign their papers again at the Human Resource Office. It was very worrying to think he couldn't predict when he'd be back to work or when things would go back to normal. He worried about money a lot over the next few weeks because there was a lot going out and nothing at all coming in. Bruna mustn't know that things were very tight in the financial department, as they say, because she wouldn't want him then. Women want men who can bring home the bread and all that, not some unemployed loser in life. That was no use. He was so close to being a winner, though, in his career, and only the virus was getting in his way. He hated that virus. You couldn't even see it, yet it was everywhere, trying to ruin your life. Bruna needed a lot of money to see her through the delay having the virus caused, and the monthly budgeting session was even more of a nightmare than he imagined, since more bills had arrived that had to be paid out of his dwindling savings, like the car service that he did every year in order to keep the car on the road. He wouldn't be able to go anywhere except the supermarket in it if restrictions were reintroduced, and in fact he had only ever shopped at the supermarket once, that time with his wife. He'd no wish to do so, as it was difficult enough shopping in the corner shop and trying to figure out what was in the boxes and cans on the shelves. He'd stuck to food he understood, like bread and eggs and cheese mostly, since she'd left. as even the frozen things in boxes were difficult to figure out how to cook. The car, though, needed to be taxed in case he was called back to work. And it couldn't be taxed without the service that was required to make sure it was roadworthy until it got the all clear. Usually there was something that had to be replaced, and he had to hire a car until they'd finished checking everything as well. All this on top of the usual bills. He was feeling very anxious about it, and it made him distracted, even when talking to Bruna, which he usually lost himself in completely, as though he was really in the jungle beside the waterfall instead of his living room. While he was talking to her one night, with her distracting him by asking which necklace he liked better with her outfit, trying on and off different things, which all looked wonderful, hanging forward as they were over the large breast cleavage that she brought close to the camera so he could see the diamonds or whatever they were in each one, she let it slip that she was coming into money soon. This caught his attention, but he didn't like to inquire about it. He didn't have to, as she told him she had an elderly aunt that was very ill, unfortunately, with the virus, and was hooked up on all sorts of breathing devices and basically in a coma. The nurses, knowing she was a chief nurse herself, had informed her that the aunt had only weeks to live. It was very sad indeed, but she'd always been her aunt's favourite, and she knew that her aunt had left her a huge amount of money, being a very wealthy woman. I see, he said, not wanting to seem too interested. I'm sorry to hear she's ill. Bruna went on to say that the only good thing about her aunt's illness was that she would be able to pay him back everything he had given her quite soon, and she'd been so reluctant to ask him for it in the first place, and so grateful that he had been generous enough to help her by giving her cash when she needed it suddenly, and it just showed what a wonderful, caring man he was. Buffalo Bill, my cowboy rescuer, she laughed. How can I ever thank you? You are my savior. Her beautiful, huge, dark eyes with their thick lashes were mesmerizing as she leaned her face towards the screen closer, and the glossy pink lips were licked, showing perfect teeth, before the tongue moved slowly across the lower, then upper lips, before she puckered up to make a kissing face, giggling at her own mischievousness. She was delightful, and it was wonderful to know she understood how helpful he'd been. The way she was moving her upper body side to side, shimmying in a similar way her avatar did, with her breasts threatening to come out of the dress as she moved, made his blood flow to his privates. He hoped she wouldn't be showing her breasts off in public when they were out together quite like that, though. It wasn't decent. He sent her more money that night before they parted, after she discussed some of the recipes she was going to cook for him, asking what his favourite things were to eat. He couldn't think of anything until he remembered he liked Yorkshire pie. You could pay her through the website, apparently, by signing up for another year membership for the webcam thing, and she would be able to get the money that way, so he wouldn't even have to go to the postal office the next day for that. He stopped worrying about the bills after that night. His problems were over. Once she'd left the hotel, got her flights, given the African orphans or whatever they were their injections, because she was going to arrange to meet him as soon as that was over. She was deeply in love with him, she said, and when he'd provided some photographs for her, which he'd had on his phone from the last holiday he was on with his wife, she said he was the sexiest man she'd ever seen, and it surprised her because really intelligent men aren't always great in the looks department, he thought was how she'd put it to him. She said he looked rugged, just like a cowboy, and said his wife must be really kicking herself to not have such a great man any more. She agreed with him when he stated it was her loss, not his. He'd had to explain Deirdre was in the picture because he'd none on his phone without her, because usually she got someone to take a photo of them together against whatever scenic tourist place they were visiting during the holiday. She kept getting positive tests and was stuck in the hotel. But they got to talk a lot about the pandemic and when it might ease, so they could meet and start planning a life together. She was using that phrase, a life together, now regularly, after they discussed meeting. She was already seeing herself in his life, and it was just the thing he needed in his life, he felt sure. He bought her several more gifts because she loved dressing nicely, and clearly this would please her. She always wanted to be wearing something that made her pretty for him, she said, although really she couldn't be any prettier, and she seemed to have endless changes of clothing and all sorts of underwear that she was always showing him. She used to run her hands over herself and tell him how it was silk and very nice on the skin, and show him the lace on it up close, and he liked that very much, even though he didn't know a lot about clothes. Chapter 32. She asked him to buy clothing for her and jewellery after that. She pointed out that he could buy the things online and gave him the links to get to the stores where the things she wanted were. Some things were very expensive, he couldn't help noticing, but since it was only for a little while to impress her before they settled into married life, and since she was going to pay the money back, as she'd assured him she would the other loans he made, he obliged, signing up with his credit card details before purchasing the ring or necklace or whatever else she wanted. Many things over the next few weeks. She asked him once if he'd like to buy a thing for her under the adult toys section of the site, and he didn't know what the thing was even after reading it. The description of it just said it was something about pleasure and said it needed a particular type of batteries which it was unclear whether it came with. She explained it to him, that it was something they could both use, and he was bewildered as he guessed it had something to do with sex, but didn't really see the point of whatever it was, to be honest. He looked at the other things she'd marked out in her list of choices of things he could buy for her, that was called a wish list, but he thought it best to avoid the topic of the round pink thing altogether, as he might show his lack of knowledge about women's things and what kind of sex activities she was using it for if she had to explain it further. He wasn't very good with electronics or talking about sex to women. In fact, Deirdre had been the only woman he'd had sex with, ever. All that would change, though. Bruna would be the second, and probably wouldn't need the pink thing, whatever it was for, when he was around. He hoped she wouldn't be too demanding in that regard, though. A couple of times a week was enough. There were plenty of chores to keep her busy, when she wasn't working, though. They'd have to broach the subject of children, too, after they were married. He'd come to realise that doing dishes and washing clothes and drying them were terribly time-consuming, not to mention having to clean floors, which involved getting the hoover out, and he hadn't even got around to dusting the shelving yet, or washing the kitchen floor, which seemed to have something sticky on it in a few spots. Having realised there wasn't much point until he knew when she was coming, as it would just have to be done again before she arrived. There weren't many people on the streets, he noticed, as he looked out the window. Of course, they had nowhere to go, again now, since the shops were shut, except for the food shops. He was getting to know the shop quite well now and where to find the items he usually bought on the different shelves. The woman without the mask didn't appear again, and he wondered if they had become stricter finally about letting unmasked types in. Perhaps the police had done some kind of inspection, or someone had reported seeing an unmasked person there, and they had received their education, as they called what the police did when they called round to tell you how you were putting everyone in danger. He would have liked to find out how about these things, but he wasn't sure how to get friendly with the shopkeeper to have a conversation about it. There was to be another round of injections, the news said. The experts had found out that some of the effects of the injection wore off after a while, and you needed another injection, a kind of top up, to be sure of not getting the virus into you and getting ill. They would have to rush new supplies in and give everyone their injection again. Until they'd done this, everyone was at risk of getting ill, and all the efforts they'd made to slow the illness down worldwide would be completely wasted. Luckily, the factories were now up to speed and able to produce more doses at a quick rate, so the new injections wouldn't take as long to organise as the last ones had. Thank goodness for that, Robert thought. Otherwise, it would be months waiting again. It was already autumn, and he tried to remember when the crisis had started. It seemed like it had been going on forever, and his life at the Human Resources Office seemed very distant, almost lost, although he could remember every detail of his desk and the filing cabinets lining the walls at the back of the room he and his co-workers had spent so much time in. He thought with a pang of jealousy of them working away while he was waiting for all this to finally be over. He wondered when that would be, given that it had gone on for so long already, and still there were problems that kept cropping up, with the virus still rampaging. He hadn't looked at the statistics for a while. He'd had other things to talk about with Bruna that took over, but he gathered there were still a lot of deaths, and the hospitals were very busy, according to the news. Bruna had confirmed this too. Deirdre rang during those first weeks, when the restrictions were back in force, to say she'd intended to move her things out of the house, but couldn't for a while now, with the restrictions on travel back. The conversation was brief, and there was no point in adding anything to it, as she clearly wasn't going to give in and come back, and he didn't want her now to, since Bruna was a better woman for him and would be his new wife soon. Deirdre had said she was filing for a divorce, and he just had to fill in some papers to show he wasn't contesting it. Then he'd receive a notice in his mail with divorce proceedings not having to go to court at all now, with the restrictions on travelling in place. She was doing the work while thinking she was punishing him for not putting up with her bullying nonsense, the stupid bitch. He'd find a way to let her know it when he married Bruna. He could post a honeymoon picture of them, with Bruna in one of her outfits on front of some exotic place, looking happy. Somewhere with a waterfall, so she could be in her leopard bikini. He giggled inwardly as Deirdre was droning on about how she'd tried and other rambling things about their relationship that were supposed to make her look like a good wife. She would fool nobody. She was the one who had been not good enough for him. It occurred to him, thinking about it afterwards, that she must have a fancy man, as they say, if she wanted a divorce. Like him, she wouldn't be able to manage financially unless she got herself another mate that was willing to marry her. Probably one of the hippies or someone they knew. They'd probably spend most of their time drinking and doing illegal drugs, if Deirdre's friends that had been to the house were anything to go by. Any money Deirdre had would go on parties with the hippies, and she would not be able to support that kind of life on a little teaching salary, let alone support a hippie as well, since they usually weren't the type that got hired with their dirty appearance and drug habits. Some man was taking Deirdre for a fool, he thought, and the thought of her downward fall made him very happy. He didn't deserve to be happy. She didn't deserve to be happy like him. He told Bruna about the divorce, and she was overjoyed. She wanted to make a proper commitment to him now, she said, since she felt she had to hold back before, knowing he was married. It just didn't feel right, she pointed out, but now it does. When she showed him her wish list excitedly the night he told her about the divorce, there was a ring on it she wanted. I hope you don't mind me showing you this, but I would have loved this ring for our engagement. It was staggeringly expensive, thousands, he couldn't help noticing, but he didn't balk too much, as he had to return to the video window to talk to her face to face, and didn't want her to think he was short of money. It's very nice, he said, after taking a gulp of air and trying to quickly weigh up his options in the situation that was developing. I know it's very presumptuous of me, talking about the ring, but I feel we've known each other forever. And I believe, she continued, we were made for each other. I just want to do everything I can to make you happy. I want to meet your every need and be the best wife to the cowboy I love as soon as possible. She did look like she wanted to. She was leaning forward, wiggling with delight at the thought of marrying him. Still, the ring was very expensive. It would nearly finish off his savings if he purchased it this month. Maybe he could stall her a few weeks until the restrictions ended and they called him back to work. Then he could get an advance or a loan from the bank, perhaps, if he could think of something to say. Luckily, she ended the conversation as she announced she had to answer the phone and said good night hastily. They talked again a couple of days later. He looked for messages from her on the phone, and there weren't any. But when he messaged her in the metaversal environment, she didn't seem to be there either, because she wasn't getting back to him. The news that night was all about the new machines that were being installed in shops and the cameras in the bigger shops, as well as the new cameras that were going up on lampposts everywhere to track criminals. He supposed they meant people breaking the law about getting masks and going out places, as well as people robbing things or getting into fights or whatever. It wasn't very interesting, except that he'd seen the woman next door earlier on going into the front garden to remove a piece of litter on the lawn before the neighbours spotted it, and thought he was dropping his standards without his wife there. It was important to keep appearances up, and the woman next door was clearly not even trying to appear to be following the law. He loathed her. She was one of those dirty hippies, he realised, as she said hello again on her way up the garden path, unmasked as usual. Her patched jeans and shabby green jacket, which seemed to be a man's army coat, made it clear she didn't care about anyone but herself, and with the mask absent and the shabby clothing, not caring about herself much either. She would be arrested, and he hoped he'd get to see it when they did. He had a message from Bruna to meet him for a video chat on her website. She was getting dressed again, and he must have arrived a bit early because she sat down without finishing and started talking about confusion. It took him a while to understand, but apparently some doctor who had been in love with her for years wanted to bring her on a cruise abroad, all expenses paid, after she finished her African work, and the restrictions lifted. He said it wasn't romantic, but she wasn't sure. She dated him a few years ago, she admitted to Robert, and he was terribly handsome and terribly charming, a real gentleman, and she loved cruises, so she really wanted to go. Should she? She asked Robert. Or do you think he still wants me? I wasn't ready to marry him because I was still in training a few years ago, but I know he still loves me. The phone call was from him, Robert, she said. I didn't tell him about you, but I asked if he still loves me, and he said of course, and that he always will. I must admit, Robert, she continued, I felt very sorry for him. Clearly he's pining away for me, and it might cheer him up a bit to go on holiday with him, particularly since he wants to treat me to it. It was very kind of him, really, she added, after a moment, reaching for a large bunch of flowers to the right of the screen, for a card attached to the stem that must, Robert gathered, be from the doctor. His private parts, which had inflated at the sight of Bruna's breasts and the expansive cleavage, much lower, showing as a dark shadow under lace, deflated now at the thought of the doctor. He had to do something, and quickly. He hit on a sudden inspiration. Bruna, he said, I wanted to propose to you tonight and buy the ring. Oh, Robert, really? She was impressed, he could tell. You really want to marry me? I was so afraid that you weren't ready for a commitment. If I accepted the ring, I'm accepting a token that you and I are going to be a team for life. He told her how important he thought teamwork was in a marriage when he told her about Deirdre and how she wasn't on his team at all and had just fooled him for a long time that she was. She gave him the link to where to buy the ring, and as soon as he'd purchased it, they made plans for the proposal to be formally accepted, because she said she wanted a traditional proposal, even though they were kept apart temporarily by the awful crisis with the virus and all the rules that had to be followed for a little longer. They could do it when the ring arrived. Was he the sort of guy who bent down on one knee when asking for a lady's hand in marriage? She asked. She thought so, as he was a gent as well as being her rugged cowboy Bill. He'd shown her that already, and she wanted to be swept off her feet and be putting the ring on when he asked again, officially, from the other side of the screen. Wouldn't that be so romantic? She asked. She was looking very pleased, and Robert felt he'd snatched her out of the claws of his rival very effectively. Yes, that would be wonderful. She would let him know the moment the ring arrived. She might have to get her visa things done tomorrow, because she'd finally got the all clear on her test to travel off to give the African children their injections. But the day after, she thought, the ring would arrive, and she could spend the whole evening with them to celebrate their engagement. She said he'd made her the happiest woman in the world, and soon she'd be the happiest wife in the world, and all his.